Metagami is a very unique tool, has to be considered a part of the office worker tool set. In order to really get an appreciation for where Metagami fits, I think it's important to get some context. So in order to provide that, I'd like to provide some history on the office worker productivity tool revolution, specifically how and when it was born, its maturation, and its ultimate stagnation. There was a 12-year period from 1978 to 1990 that was very, very active and very fertile as it applied to office worker productivity tools. Specifically, in 1978, DBase was introduced as the first database system for personal computers, and then followed soon thereafter in 1979 by VisiCalc, which was the first spreadsheet tool for personal computers. It was a couple of years later before the first PCs were introduced. So in the early days, 78, 79, and 80, the DBase and the VisiCalc tools were used on, for the most part, Apple computers. A big change took place in 1981 when the PC came into existence because it quickly overtook Mac, Apple's product, as the personal computer for corporations and large organizations, thus for office workers. And then in 1983, Lotus 123 replaced VisiCalc as the spreadsheet of choice. And in 1984, Foxbase replaced DBase as the database of choice. And then another major significant event took place when in 1985, Microsoft introduced the Windows operating system, and the spreadsheets and databases that were used, as I said, predominantly Lotus and Foxbase, became a part of the Windows, ultimately the Windows operating system. And then in 1987, Microsoft introduced Excel, which took over for the Lotus position as a spreadsheet. Same year, they introduced PowerPoint as the presentation manager. And then in 1990, Microsoft Office was introduced, which included then, and still includes as the four major elements, Excel as a spreadsheet, Word as the document processor, the word processor, PowerPoint as the presentation manager, and Access, which was the new name for Foxbase. Microsoft acquired the company that owned Foxbase and introduced Access a couple of years later after the Microsoft Office suite was introduced, and it became the fourth major component of Microsoft Office. So that 12-year period that was so fertile, so lush with incredible activities, was the period during which the dramatic changes took place in the office worker productivity tools arena. Interestingly, for the 30 years following 1990, that period was as barren of new developments as the 12 years before were lush with those developments. Think about that. A 30-year period from 1990 till now of virtually nothing, modifications to each of the products, refinements, nothing substantive changed, however. It's 2.5 times as long as the period during which all of the development of these kinds of tools took place. Pretty amazing. And I've wondered why that happened. What is it that all of a sudden cut off all the new concepts, all the new methodologies, all the new products in 1990? There are now 1.2 billion users of Microsoft Office. You'd think that something would have been done to take over the position or to add new value through new kinds of products. But as I thought about it, I began to get an answer because in 1990, the same year that Microsoft Office was introduced, another event took place that was very significant. The internet came into commercial being, and all of the best minds that were previously focused on office worker productivity tools for 12 years focused instead on the internet. How can it be used? What impact can it have? What companies, what products ought to be introduced on the internet? And that refocus was then enhanced in 2007 when Apple introduced the iPhone as the first mobile device. Once again, the best and the brightest left the office tool productivity arena behind, and in some cases the internet behind, and now mobile devices became the focus of all the smart developers. So the period from 1990 to the period of now, 2020, represented virtually nothing because those people who would have otherwise been working on office tools began to focus on more exciting arenas in their mind. I asked myself, why were the products that are a part of Microsoft Office so successful? Interestingly, I think that if you were to order the products in terms of how often they're used, Excel and or Word would be at the top of the list, PowerPoint would be next, and far below them in terms of usage would be Access, the database. So upon reflecting on why those tools that are so successful, like Excel, are successful, I began to realize that Excel, for example, has a manual, a hard copy metaphor, the columnar pads that we used back in the day before computers to do budgets and other kinds of calculations. Those columnar pads that you see here are exactly the kinds of things that take place on a spreadsheet, although spreadsheets, of course, are far more capable because the electronic environment makes it more capable. But the ability of people to relate to a manual paradigm, a hard copy, made Excel quickly adopted. Similarly with Word. Word is really a typewriter. Keyboards are the same for the most part. Now we've added some new keys, but the keyboards are the same as a typewriter. The production is of a page of words, very much like Word is the page of words. Once again, the electronic features give it more strength and more prowess than the typewriter, but an easy transition from the typewriter to the Word as a means of producing documents. PowerPoint is the same. When you think about it, PowerPoint is really a piece of paper. It's a page on which we're putting objects, just as this page is a page that could have just as easily been replicated with drawings with a pen and paper on a piece of hard copy paper. So the more popular elements of Microsoft Office, Excel, Word, and PowerPoint, all have a paradigm that's easy to relate to from a non-electronic perspective. Then we have Access. Access is a database. What does that mean? What compares with the database from a manual hard copy perspective? Really nothing. Maybe a file cabinet with file folders, maybe a notebook with tabs, but really the concepts of records and fields and files of databases has no manual correlation, nothing to compare it to, and as a consequence, people who try to use not only Access, but any database, of which Access is a pretty simple example, end up being confused, frustrated, and angry because they know there's something there that they need, but they literally don't know how to go about taking advantage of it and don't want to spend the time or have the time, for the most part, to figure out how to use this conceptual tool. Well, I mentioned to you that in 1990, the best and the brightest minds began to focus on the internet and then subsequently on mobile devices, but those of us who were involved with Metagami did not. Metagami's concept became something that we wanted to deal with a couple of years before 1990. In 1987, 1988, the very first thinking about Metagami came into existence. And in much the same way as Excel, Word, and PowerPoint have hard copy metaphors, so does Metagami. Just like PowerPoint uses a hard copy page as its metaphor, so does Metagami. Everything you do in Metagami is on a page. You don't need to know anything about database concepts whatsoever, while in the background what you're creating is the most sophisticated database on the market. The pages, like I say, all begin this way, but can be advanced to look any way you want them to look. You're simply putting fields on a page and using them, as we'll talk about a bit more later, but you could put fields on a piece of paper manually that would look exactly like this. And in fact, this is an example of an invoice that came from a hard copy invoice as the foundation. So the consequence of that is people who are aware of the background of other products, like Chris Boyle, who for 20 years was in financial management, 3 years at Oracle and 2 years at Salesforce, said upon seeing Metagami that he'd never seen anything like it. And he wishes that he would have had Metagami 20 years ago when he was using Excel to do his financial analysis and modeling. Or Stan Miller, who's the partner in a regional law firm, becoming a national law firm, but also is really a serial entrepreneur who recognizes the unbelievable potential of Metagami. As he says, wow, this could be another Microsoft. Certainly it could. Whether that in fact happens or not remains to be seen. There are a lot of other issues, but he certainly recognizes that the Metagami product is that unique. So the period from 78 to 90 was very fertile. From 90 to 2020 was not at all in terms of office productivity tools, but we believe that the period from 2020 into the future will be significantly impacted in the office worker productivity environment by Metagami. Not because we expect to replace Microsoft Office, we do not, but rather because we know that Metagami has a place as a complement to those tools that are currently being used to replace much of which is being done in those tools less adequately than it could be done in Metagami. Certainly the Office tools will continue to be used. We do expect Metagami to provide the means of more effective and efficient analysis and development. So why do we think that? Well, let's go back for a moment and think about the vision of Metagami. The vision of the company that owns Metagami is to provide software focused expressly on end users. IT organizations and IT people don't really understand end users, and as a consequence, they fail to deliver what end users want all too often. Metagami is the end user tool that can relate so that the end user can relate to Metagami as easily as they would relate to pieces of paper. And Metagami itself, plus the value-added resellers and the applications, are designed specifically to focus on small and medium-sized businesses and nonprofit organizations, which isn't to say that we can't address large entities. We've done work for Boeing and NASA and others with Metagami. We just believe that there's a problem in the small and medium-sized organizations with the cost of some of these tools that Boeing and NASA can afford. So not only is Metagami the ecosystem designed to accommodate small business needs as well as large, but it's delivered at a price point specifically for that small and medium-sized organization. There are three foundational elements which, when taken together, distinguish Metagami. The first is that it's simple. It's literally as easy to use as Excel, or easier in some ways when you start getting into some of the fancy stuff that Metagami does, like macros and pivot tables. Metagami is far, far, far easier to relate to. It's very dynamic. Traditional databases require one to think in advance what you plan to do so that you can create a structure to accommodate that. Once those structures are created, they're not easily changed, and as a consequence, become far more static. And those things that users forgot when they were designing the database or learned later on that they need to incorporate don't get incorporated in traditional databases. That's not the case with Metagami. The same things you do for the first steps in building something with Metagami are the same things that you do later. You add pages and fields, as I'll explain later, and the environment within Metagami accommodates what those new pages and fields and processes, as identified by the end user, are. And the third element is data integration. Excel does calculations and numbers very well, but not well, doesn't do text well. Word does text very well, but doesn't do calculations very well. Metagami accommodates any kind of field that you put on a piece of paper, plus audios and videos, images, graphs, tables, data, that's numeric data, that's character data, word processing capabilities, buttons, any kind of data can go on a Metagami page, and as a consequence of that, the ability to put together very unique solutions accommodating all data types becomes a part of Metagami and is the third foundational element. And because of these three taken together, not necessarily individually, but all three together are what discriminate and differentiate Metagami from other products and makes Metagami a useful tool for developing applications, for customizing applications, and for analyzing data. So what do I mean by that? Well, applications once developed have pages with fields on them and buttons such as this in a menu where the buttons direct the user to go to a particular page or set of pages to do the kinds of things implied or stated by the button. The user doesn't need to know anything about Metagami itself, just use the applications created by a developer who could be IT trained or completely unknowledgeable about technical issues like IT. Or here's another example of a menu that is in the small business suite of products. Actually, I'm sorry, the earlier one was. This one is in a nonprofit, the main menu for a nonprofit organization that includes the various kinds of buttons that direct them through the things that are relevant to that organization. And then once buttons are clicked, you can have pages that are designed to enter data, such as this, which is a contact information page with name, address, phone number, contact information, and descriptors, just as easily as a report-oriented solution, such as this, which delivers the data that's requested in a report format. Reports, data entry, all of those capabilities exist within applications developed by those who want to use Metagami to create products such as these. Applications can be customized by users who would begin with an application developed by a developer, but want to refine it to their own particular needs. And as I stated earlier, it's done in the same way as a developer would begin to use Metagami. You create a new page by clicking the New Page button. You put fields on the page by clicking the New Field button, once for each field. You then use the fields. It's the third thing. Metagami requires you to create a page, create fields, use the fields, and perform calculations. Those are the four basic elements that 99% of the people using Metagami will do. When you want to identify what the field is to be, you hit the right mouse, click the Appearance tab, and there are a series of icons in the oval that define what the field is going to be. The field could be a field to enter data like IBM. It could be a graph field like the monthly data graph below that. It could be an image, as the shirt exemplifies, a video, an audio, a word processing field, a table. All of those things are determined by the right mouse click, selecting the Appearance tab, and picking the icon that describes what you're trying to do, all simple point and click. And then calculations are created just in the same way as Excel, drag and drop. In this case, we drag the first field on the page called F101 into this calculation tab. Once again, right mouse click, click the calculation tab, and drag and drop your calculation. So we have field 101 being multiplied by field 102 and having the value in the bottom field. And here you see 15 in field 1, F101, 10 in field F102 produces the product of 150 in F106, the sixth field on the page. But you also can customize applications that exist by hiding fields. Oftentimes, applications may include fields that are not relevant to particular users or particular organizations. Right mouse click, click the Appearance tab, and then there's a visibility drop-down where you can determine whether the fields are to be seen. The default is always, but you can change that to never. And by doing that on these three fields that are highlighted, excuse me, you see that when we go into the run mode to use the page, those three fields are no longer there. The user would not see them. I should say they're not visible, even though they're there and can be active, but the users need not see them if they would just add confusion. In addition to developing applications and analyzing and customizing applications, Metagami is ideal as a tool for analysis, slicing and dicing data, looking at it in various ways, going from one query to another to understand more about what the data implies, where each new bit of information that is yielded would produce another question potentially. Just a free-form kind of analysis. This is a summary of an analytical process that shows for a particular campaign in a particular office for an organization that solicits donations for nonprofit organizations, what the various solicitors have done, how many calls they've made, how many contacts, what percentage of the contacts of the calls have resulted in a contact, and so on for all the columns across the page. And then at the bottom, a total, an average, and a median for the individual columns so that you can do peer analysis to determine how a particular solicitor does in comparison to others. This is a formalized report, but the free-form nature of Metagami is ideal for the kind of analysis that may end up not producing a report like this, but resulting in continual new bits of information to understand more about the data that you're working with. So we say that Metagami's tagline is users rule and data serves because that's really the case. It is all about the user. It is not the data that dictates what the user's going to do. The users dictate how they want to go about doing what they want to do, and Metagami supports that. Now, let's move to the particular application prototype that I put together for BfitBwell. All of the pages, as I mentioned, are included in the Pages tab under individual folders. Very simplistic prototype, and we have here a menus folder in which we have a very simple menu. So let's open the menu and close the Pages drawer, and you'll see that there are two buttons on this page. One is a setup button to allow users without any knowledge of Metagami to create the structural elements that they need for this particular and any other application. It's not uncommon to have a setup such as this. So when we click the setup button, we have 5 buttons to direct us to particular pages. On this page, we identify the body parts that we want to use for a higher level of discussion of our individual exercises. Core roof, core walls, hinge. I've taken some liberties and created cardio here as well. Of course, we want to identify the exercises. The exercises end up having a little more information about them. Here we have the various exercises that I knew about that I created an instance for. By the way, you'll notice that, let's go to dead bug, for example. You'll notice that there are fields on these pages that have a blue border. The fields with the blue border are called identifier fields. They are drop-down fields, and as I showed you, they create instances. Each value in a particular identifier field or set of identifier fields determines to whom or to what the data on that instance applies. So in the case of the dead bug, this data applies to the dead bug. If I go to the dead bug with weight, this data applies to that particular exercise. So here we have now a drop down with body parts derived from that first table of body parts that I created, that the user would create. Here we have instructions in a document field on how to go about doing the dead bug. Here's a picture of the dead bug, and if it were to be more pertinent, we would have here a video that would show the user actually producing or conducting a dead bug exercise. So there is an option for any kind of explanation or demonstration of each of the exercises and their associated body part. Here we have a button that returns us to the preceding page. Thought it might be helpful to be able to view the exercises associated with each body part. So here are those exercises that had a link to core. Here are exercises that are associated with hinge, and so on. Once again, this drop-down contains all of those body parts identified on the first page I showed you, and if we were to add body parts, then this and all other fields that relate to that would be updated accordingly. Part of the dynamic process that I mentioned. Now, let's get into participants. There are, in my example, 3 participants, 3 people that are going through BfitBwell. We want to be sure we know who they are. And when we start BfitBwell, we do a pre-program assessment. Here are 4 of the elements included in that. Obviously, there are 2 or 3 dozen of them. I didn't want to burden the application or the user by seeing a bunch of them unnecessarily, but here are examples of 4 assessment elements: BMI, body fat percentage, grip strength dominant, grip strength non-dominant hand, and the unit of measure that's used to describe them. So now that we have all of those structural elements, let's go back to the main menu and look at the actual participant. Well, the first thing that we do, as I mentioned, and you know when we come into BfitBwell, is do the pre-program assessment. Mine took place on September 6, 2019, and here are the values for those 4 items that I included. I did a post-program assessment, as all participants do, on the 22nd of November. Here are the values recorded for me at that post-program assessment. So it's important to notice that this name is set to me, but there are 2 instances, one Dan for September 6th, another Dan for November 22nd, each containing data specific to me on each of those 2 dates. If we were to pick another participant, like Carolyn or Terry or whomever, we would then identify the dates of their pre and post assessments, and there would be more instances created specific to their dates and them as individuals. Jared does a really nice job of putting this information together and sending it to those of us who participate in the program. I thought a tabular view might be helpful as well. So here we have the ability to see for Dan on any particular date. My first date was September 6th. My post date was November 22nd. So I identify those dates, and this then shows you the items, my pre-assessment, my post-assessment, the numeric value of the change, and the percentage change that occurred for each of the various, in this case, 4 items, but in fact 2 or 3 dozen items would follow the same pattern. Now, the thing that's particularly cool about this is this information is very useful to the participant in the program, but I know in speaking with Jared that he's indicated a desire to do some correlation analysis of, for example, leg press, how much you can press compared to sit and stand. The ability to see if there are correlations with regard to various elements. Jared has a lot of statistical products. Right now, Metagami isn't designed to do that, but certainly the ability to do correlations and to understand more about relationships is very much a part of what can be done with Metagami. And the data will be there already if we make it available for participants. So there's no need to enter and re-enter the data. There's no need to enter it into Excel and move it over here. If the data is entered into here the first time, it's available not only for participants and trainers, but also for Jared and others who are interested in doing data analysis. Now, let's look at what the personal trainers go through for those of us who are participating, and ultimately what we go through when we've completed the program. So for Dan, we want to identify which body part, which exercises for each body part Dan can do. Dan, in my particular case, I have lower back problems and I have knee problems, so certain exercises just not accommodate me, and the trainers were kind enough to reflect upon that, determining that core, there was nothing that wasn't okay for me, so all of those are checked. But if I go to, and those that are checked as acceptable appear over here as those that are okay for me to do. But if I go to hinge, there are 5 exercises. I've noted only one as being acceptable, and that appears over here. If in fact I were to click deadlifts, then there are in fact 2 that are acceptable for me, and this will now provide the list of exercises I can do. I know in talking with Becca, she asked about whether we couldn't do this automatically, and the answer is, of course. If we want to say people with lower back shouldn't do these kinds of exercises, people with knee problems shouldn't do these exercises, we could do that in advance, and then the participant can either identify for themselves what their either momentary or long-term ailments are, and the exercises accommodating their unique set of ailments will be available to them from those that have been created as being okay unless you have these particular kinds of ailments. So this process, which is designed to be done manually, can be replaced very easily with one that's done electronically and automatically to save time from the trainers having to do all of that. So now let's go to a workout. For example, here's Dan on 12:10. His core options are all listed here. You'll recall that there were no core exercises in the system that I couldn't do. So all of the exercises that are core related are okay to me. And what was designed was plank and do it to fatigue. If I also was to be assigned, let's say, a mountain climber, then we could put mountain climber and 10 reps. If I were to be assigned a fireman carry, we would have, let's say, 15 pounds. So that would be my assignments for 12:10. In fact, if we go to January 8th, we'll see some legitimate assignments that I created for myself within the core area for what I was going to do on January 8th. If we then go back and return to what my workout is, let's go to January 8th. And here you will see from all body parts, those items that I assigned or a personal trainer would have assigned during the program, 90-day program period. Excuse me. And then at the bottom, what exercises were actually completed. The suitcase deadlift, I was to do 10 reps. I did 10 reps. I didn't note it here, but should have, so we'll do that at 25 pounds. And each of the exercises that I did, if I were to have done, for example, a side plank, this gives me the opportunity, or something that would require a left and a right, the opportunity to identify left versus right. Here was the weight that I lifted, or the reps that I did. Here's the RPE on each, the overall RPE, and notes that I made to myself or that a personal trainer would make during the period about, in my case, I might try 25 pounds next time for the dumbbell overhead press, Might try 30 next time because 25 seemed to be okay. And that would be the vehicle that would then allow me to understand for each of my workouts what I did and what I wanted to do next. There are lots of different enhancements. Becca talked about scheduling. I understand that's a priority. Easy enough to do. We would just need to sit down and talk about what that entails. We talked about automating the process of determining what ailments, determine what exercises. I've actually thought about doing something similar to what we do for the pre and post assessments for the individuals that want to go back and say, how did I do last year on these various items compared to how I'm doing now? So we can each track our own progress. Part of what makes this exciting is the ability to see growth in our ability to do various kinds of things. So the beauty of Metagami, as I said, is simple enough where any of you could use it, dynamic, so that as you think of new things, which is what we did when we were meeting yesterday, as you think of new things that you'd like to do, they can be incorporated without limit, and continue to evolve the product so that it can accommodate not only the participants, but the trainers, and maximize the time that the trainers have to work with people, which is what want to do, and minimize the amount of time that must be spent doing scheduling or doing planning for the personal training meetings, so that you can bring in more people to help and do the things that the trainers want to do and do them productively and efficiently by not having to be bothered by those that are not in compliance. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that, and I look forward to talking with you further about this opportunity as you've had a chance to discuss it amongst yourselves.